thank you so much for your grace and flexibility as we have had much good information from our opening session and needed a little bit more time to go into that and to share it with each other and ask questions. And we are glad that you've returned to this place. I am privileged to work for the Department of Civil Rights here in Michigan in the the Division for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And it is my privilege to introduce our moderator for today. Our workshop this morning in this place is the State of Fair Housing in Michigan, Past, Present, and Possibilities. And as we begin, I would like to preemptorily thank and now introduce to you the moderator for the session, Rebecca Irby. Rebecca Irby is the Director of Transformational Change at New Detroit. New Detroit is working to dismantle racism in the Metro Detroit region, responding to the reality that racism is a public health crisis. New Detroit develops extensive portfolio of trainings, tools, and services for creating equitable strategies, policies, and practices. Rebecca Irby is gifted in many areas, but as our moderator for today, I am particularly appreciative of her passion for developing heart-centered leaders who embody empathy, mindfulness, and courage in this essential work. We are grateful for her work in our communities and for her presence as moderator with us this morning. Please welcome Rebecca Irby.
Thank you so much for that, Kristen. It is such an honor and a pleasure to be here with you all today. As Kristen mentioned, my name is Rebecca Irby, Director of Transformational Change at New Detroit. We have our lovely t-shirts that we're promoting here. Racism is a public health crisis, something that we can all add to and contribute to ending systemic racism. So as we get started today, I have the distinct honor and pleasure of introducing our panel as we get started. This session is designed to share a few facts and figures and other information to capture the current state of fair housing, not only in our state, but also the country. And to that end, we've assembled an excellent panel for you today. We have Dr. Roshanak Mahapani, who is the Director of Housing Solutions for Health Equity at the University of Michigan. She's going to be our first presenter and has some really incredible information that she's going to be sharing with a slide deck. The rest of our panelists will be speaking, and we're going to have a robust conversation, and we're going to be ending with Q&A. So please collect your questions and hold them for us. Next, we have Haywood Edwards, who's the inclusion specialist with the Michigan State Housing Development Authority. Stephen Shelton, staff attorney with Legal Services of Eastern Michigan. And last but certainly not least, Sonia Merriweather, Deputy Director of Investigations with the Michigan Department of Civil Rights. To read their full bios, please check out the Whova app and look under our session and click on their names to see more information about them. So as we get started today, we do have just a few ground rules to get started. This workshop is about fair housing, not just housing. So we want to focus on bias, discrimination, and disparate impacts of buying or renting a home or related to credit ratings and mortgages, as we heard earlier today. We would like the session to end with 2 to 3 specific policy recommendations for moving fair housing forward. To this end, we really encourage potential solutions and discussing this as a group. We have note takers in the audience ready to capture your amazing ideas and solutions. Please keep the discussion focused on the topic at hand. For example, unfortunately, we are not able to address individual complaints or circumstances. We want to focus on broad policy discussions. Lastly, we're all coming from different backgrounds and perspectives. For this to be a productive conversation, we need to create a safe space for dialogue. Empathy and respect are of the utmost importance, and so we will not tolerate inappropriate, inflammatory, or disrespectful behavior or language. You will respectfully be warned once and then asked to leave. As we get ready for this discussion, there are three things I want to leave us with as we embark on this conversation. Here at New Detroit, we like to start all policy discussions with three questions. And those are, who've been invited to the conversation? Who are we thinking of? Number two, who do we typically show our work to after or as it's being completed, but are not typically invited into the planning process? And lastly, who is completely forgotten and left behind in the planning as well as the execution of said policies? We advocate for all three of these groups to be included in the planning process, for us to have robust solutions that are grounded and have the support of community to move forward. Without further ado, I will ask Shonik to come up and present her slides.
Thank you, Rebecca. My name is Roshanik Medapana. I'm a professor at the School of Public Health and director of the Housing Solutions for Health Equity, as Rebecca mentioned. Can I get my slides, please? As Rebecca mentioned, the work that I'll be presenting to you is really based on kind of numbers and the research that we do. I would not be here without my community partners, particularly the Fair Housing Center in Detroit. And so thanks to those folks who help us collect that data so that we can do essentially the research on it and work with them to disseminate it. So I start with all my talks with housing is a determinant of health. And although most of you get that, you'd be surprised how housing still lacks in conversations when we talk about determinants of health. And for those who might not be familiar, determinants of health refer to the conditions in which people are born, live, learn, work, play, worship, and age. And where they live then impacts essentially their functioning, their quality of life, and those long-term impacts over time. We talk about housing as a multi-dimensional determinant of health with various factors affecting it. So we talk about housing affordability, we talk about housing conditions, and we also talk about housing access beyond financial means. And in particular, when we talk about it here, we're talking about discrimination that folks have experienced in attaining that house. So housing discrimination and health equity, we know that unaffordable, inaccessible, and poor quality homes have very powerful impacts on people's health at the individual level, but then also at the neighborhood level, we know that neighborhoods with greater disinvestment lack the resources, so they don't have as good quality schools, access to food, access to places to play. And we know that a greater proportion of non-white racialized groups, particularly non-Hispanic Blacks and Hispanics or Latinx, are impacted by this disinvestment. However, we talk about the distribution of resources by city. We don't talk about as much about the distribution of resources by cities and counties. And partly to that is that we need to have much more deeper conversations about the structural forces that have created and reinforced neighborhood inequities, across our states and counties. So how many of you have seen redlining maps before? Perfect, okay. So for those who haven't, really quickly, the Home Loan Owners Loan Corporation in the 1930s created these maps to classify neighborhoods by their perceived level of lending risk. So A depicted the best, B predicted still desirable, C or yellow, was definitely declining, and D was recognized as hazardous. And it happened, it just correlated that areas that were depicted as definitely declining and hazardous had a higher percentage of Black and brown folks living in them. And so redlining really did institutionalize neighborhood racial segregation, and it restricted access to home ownership for non-white racialized home buyers. What this means is that redline neighborhoods have experienced this long-term disinvestment, and research has connected historical redlining to various factors, including lower credit scores and disinvestment, foreclosure, violence, physical factors like excess heat, and health outcomes such as preterm birth and mental health, all of these contributing to really disparate health impacts and health inequities. So I really appreciated Secretary Johnson's recognition of the study that we did on historic redlining practices in Detroit metro area, where we wanted to really understand what were these long-term impacts of redlining, not necessarily on a specific health outcome, but on health opportunities. And so by those health opportunities, we looked at whether median household income, home ownership, employment, high school education, children living above poverty, health insurance, and those having less working commutes, how that would differ over time. And what we found is, you'll see in this map on your left-hand side, illustrates the redlining maps of the Detroit metro area. And on the right, we have this determinants of health score, which comprises all of those factors that I mentioned. And you can see that those areas that are in darkest blue on your right-hand side are referred to the highest quantile of scores. So those that are in darkest represent that they are doing worse. And so you can see some correspondence between the two. But what I'll do is actually break it down a little bit further to show you this table that has been designed to show how each level, so the green, the blue line, the yellow line, and the red line fare across most contemporary indicators. And our study saw that there was a $60,000 difference in present-day median household income between neighborhoods that were historically green-lined compared to those that were red-lined. And we also saw an almost 30% difference in home ownership between these neighborhoods. And I'll stop here, but during our discussion, I'm happy to talk about this further, but just last week we released the 2022 Michigan-wide housing needs assessment, and our study found that in Michigan, 45% of Black households are homeowners compared to 79% of white households who are homeowners. So that's a 34-point percentage difference that exists in this state, which kind of is mixed across the country as a whole. And so those are issues that we need to be discussing. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Roshana. Next, we have Stephen Sheldon.
Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I don't have any props or slides. I'm just me. As I said in the introduction, I am a staff attorney at the Fair Housing Center, Legal Services of Eastern Michigan, where I enforce fair housing law. Before that, I was an attorney in private practice for between 15 and 20 years, doing mostly criminal defense work, a lot of which was court appointed. So when I look at issues of fair housing and discrimination and civil rights in general, I kind of look at it through those lenses. And I want to take kind of more of a wide, almost historic kind of look at what's the state of fair housing in Michigan. Because if we look at our history, we can see that things are changing, and that's the one thing that remains constant is change. Throughout most of our society's history, discrimination has been sanctioned by and even enforced by the government, right? There are people alive today who remember when, redlining was a real thing, when it was happening, and neighborhoods were government mandated to be restricted by race, even in Michigan, which you don't think of as part of the Deep South, where a lot of this stuff is more prominent. But here in Michigan, that was still happening. We don't have that anymore in terms of that kind of mandate because we've adopted a newer model. we've adopted a model that focuses on inclusion instead of exclusion, right? We want to integrate and not segregate. And as a result, some of those practices that were mandated by the government not terribly long ago are now illegal. It is completely swapped. And something else has happened as well, which is that over time, societal attitudes have changed, right? Once upon a time, not so long ago, and I'm 50-something years old, so I grew up in the 70s and 80s. Even back then, in a lot of mainstream America, it was perfectly acceptable to express racist, sexist, homophobic views. That's not so much the case anymore today, right? Mainstream America gives kind of the proverbial stink eye to people who express those views in a very overt manner. Now, I know we all have the internet, so we all know that there are some outliers out there who still cling to those old views. But for the most part, Americans have started to take a dim approach, a dim view of bigotry. And what this has resulted in is, over time, a change in how we see discrimination, how we encounter discrimination in housing. So a lot of what we see now is more subtle and less direct. For instance, we just heard about redlining, and I assume there's going to be a lot of discussion about that today. When I see things like redlining and I see that there are disparities between home ownership that falls along racial lines, when I see there are neighborhoods that are still segregated, when I see over-policing of minority neighborhoods, when I see over-prosecution of minority defendants, when I see that there are income and education gaps that fall along racial and gender lines, it's clear that that is a machination, that is the outcome, the legacy, if you will, of bad policies of the past. And that continues to work on its own, even without anybody trying to push it. So we do run across a lot of that. But that's not to say that intentional one-on-one discrimination doesn't happen either. Because it is there. It's just more subtle and it's harder to detect. At the Fair Housing Center, we do a lot of testing. Typically what we'll do is we will send out 2 testers to a property. They'll be pretty much the same demographically in every manner, except one of them will belong to a protected class. And what's interesting is when we get the reports back, our protected tester will talk about, wow, this property manager or this landlord was really, really nice and very welcoming and friendly, and they were very helpful. I had a great experience. And then we get their report and we compare it to our control tester, and we see that while this landlord or property manager was smiling to our protected tester's face and being very friendly, they were also telling them no apartments were available when there in fact were. Or they would only tell them about the most expensive apartments. Or they would exaggerate the price of the rent or of the security deposit to try to dissuade them from applying. So that kind of discrimination does still happen, but it's not the same as we used to see decades ago. I mean, it's been a long time since anybody saw a whites only sign in the lobby of a hotel or an apartment building, right? And that's a good thing. That's a very good thing. That means we're making progress. And there's one other form of discrimination, which is the newer form of discrimination that we're running across, and this is what we deal with a lot. There are some things that were not considered discrimination until relatively recently. Until the passage of the Fair Housing Act amendments and the Americans with Disabilities Act, so the 80s and 90s, it wasn't even considered discrimination to refuse to accommodate someone who had a disability. But now, that is the most common complaint that HUD gets. And that bears out with our experience as well. We deal mostly with disabilities discrimination cases at the Fair Housing Center. And I will say, I think, in addition to the kinds of discrimination that we see shifting, when it comes at least to disabilities discrimination, I think the motivations behind the discrimination are also different. And I think it's important to understand the motivations because that's the only way you can combat it. Most of the discrimination we see in terms of disability comes from basically 4 motivations. One is laziness. You have landlords who just don't want to do anything. And if you say, I need an accommodation or a modification, that means they might have to get up from their chair, and they're just not going to do it. Similar to that, the second one we see a lot, the second motivation for discrimination and disabilities is greed. You have these are primarily the landlords who have houses that are in disrepair, houses that may not even be technically habitable. There's a hole in the roof and the toilet's about to fall into the crawl space because the wood's all rotted in the bathroom. They're not going to fix those, so they're certainly not going to be willing to let you lower a peephole or put on a wheelchair ramp, because their job, in their opinion, is just to collect money and do nothing else. The third one that we run across is one that I like to call oppositional defiance disorder as a business model. And you're going to laugh at this, but I see this all the time. These are landlords and property managers who take the position, nobody's going to tell me how to run my business, and if they tell me, I'm going to do the opposite just to show them. So if you come to them and you say, I need an accommodation for X, Y, or Z, they're usually going to refuse. And when you point out that they're legally entitled or legally required to do so, they just dig in their heels and fight harder. I can't even tell you how many times I've had somebody who it would cost them literally nothing, but they refuse to provide the accommodation, and so we end up having to go to court, and it costs them a lot of money in the end. And the fourth big motivation I see when it comes to disabilities discrimination, and I think this is disabilities discrimination, again, I think it's kind of the new frontier, if you will, for discrimination and fair housing. But the fourth one I see, and this is the major one, is cynicism. There are certain landlords and property managers who assume that anyone who asks for an accommodation or modification is trying to work some kind of an angle. They're trying to scam their way into something that nobody else is entitled to. And they just refuse to grant it on their so-called principles. I find this a lot when it comes to especially service animals and emotional support animals. So those are the new sorts of discrimination that we're dealing with. And if you look at the grand scale of the state of housing, of fair housing in Michigan, you see that there is definitely work to be done. We have a long way to go. But as I said earlier, the kinds of discrimination we see have changed over time, and they're continuing to change, and they're becoming more subtle, they're becoming less overt, and the reason for that is that we are having an impact. And so I'd like to thank everybody who's in the fair housing community for the work that you do, because I think that you are responsible for a lot of that change. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that, Stephen. Next, we would like to introduce and invite Haywood Edwards.
Haywood Edwards. I'm an inclusion specialist with the Michigan State Housing Development Authority, and I'm honored to be here today. I want to thank you, Steve, and our other speakers who are here and our panelists. It's an amazing opportunity to discuss the state of fair housing. Steve mentioned that discrimination has changed. The way that it presents itself is different. To piggyback on that, Steve, I like to say that whether new or old, discrimination is still here. That access to fair housing is still being prevented and limited. I think back to Special Order, Field Order 15, that when the gates of plantation swung open at the end of the Civil War, formerly enslaved black people, they walked out onto these muddy roads, and as they sought sanctuary, this order allotted 40 acres. The mules that were used in the army, that were just idle at that point, they were kind of assigned as part of a package. It's something that we call 40 acres and a mule. And so that bit of hope that Black Americans had in that moment, to finally have a place that they could call home, where they could farm the land and to feed their families. That opportunity was quickly snuffed out by President Andrew Johnson, who decided that that land should go back to those Confederate landowners because they had been discriminated against. And so from that moment on, as you look back through history, Black people, people of color, minorities, and all the other terms that we use, people have been discriminated against. Whether it was a Black officer, a Black infantryman in the trenches next to their Caucasian counterpart, fighting for the United States of America in some foreign land. But when that white American returned home, they were able to utilize government programs to purchase homes, to get an education. And as we know, that ability to acquire a home is the first step to generational wealth. And so that Black American who came home sometimes with missing limbs and PTSD, even before they knew what PTSD was denied that opportunity to utilize that government program to purchase a home. And so we can take many of those instances and go back through history and identify the times when discrimination occurred. And fast forward to the Fair Housing Act, the Fair Housing Acts of the 60s, and how this was supposed to liberate us, to protect us, to give us this opportunity to fair housing. But yet in 2019, Black homeownership levels were just as bad as they were before the implementation of the Fair Housing Act. Just let that sink in. And so, Steve, as you said, discrimination may have changed the way that it presents itself, but it's still there. And so, as mentioned earlier, I look around the room and I see people that are part of this fair housing ecosystem. Lawyers and advocates and government professionals, and those who are attorneys, those who are fighting for the rights of those who want fair housing. We have a lot of work to do. It was fitting that as I came down last night to avoid the morning traffic getting to Detroit, I forgot my tie, which I usually wear a tie. But I think it's fitting because I brought my hard hat today. And I think that looks a little bit better without the tie. And I brought it just to show that, yes, as a representative of MSHDA and all the other hats that I wear, I'm prepared to go to work. I'm prepared to work hard to make sure that fair housing is an attainable goal. That 10 years from now, we shouldn't be looking at the dismal statistics that we've seen, whether it's the discrimination now through AI. Many of us will say, we don't care what you call us, just give us our rights. Because some people will be prejudiced and go to their grave holding on to those prejudices. But it's our job at MSHDA and other agencies to make sure that that's not reflected in our policies and our programs. And so that's my job. My hand is to the plow, Brother Van, and I'm not looking back because we have a lot of work to do. And I'm excited to be here with you all. So glad that you can come. Let's continue to work together to make this happen. Thank you.
Thank you for those inspiring words, Haywood. Next, we have Sonia Merriweather.
Good morning, everyone. Again, my name is Sonia Merriweather, and I am a Deputy Director with the Michigan Department of Civil Rights, and I am in the Grand Rapids office. My goal today is to share with you information on the types of housing complaints that are investigated and what they may look like, and we'll talk a little bit about that during our discussion. So what I wanted to say is that MDCR is a neutral state government agency, and although we are not advocates, we are committed to fair housing, and we are committed to preventing discrimination. And we are a law enforcement agency, and we assess each and every concern brought to our department. On average, we process about 600 to 700 contacts per month. And if the concern is timely, a basis is named, and if it's jurisdictional, a complaint can be taken. And I also wanted to, we will be talking about the type of complaints that we do take, but I'll tell you just a little bit about our process. If a housing complaint is taken, the department also files a complaint with HUD, as we have a partnership with HUD. And the department completes the investigation, and HUD does adopt our finding. Once a complaint is taken and signed by the claimant, both parties are served the complaint, and the investigative process begins. The respondent is sent a set of interrogatory questions to respond to a specific date. And the date varies, but it's approximately 10 days. In the meantime, the claimant has been asked what they are seeking to resolve the complaint, because we do try to resolve complaints, and we do try to educate both claimants and respondents. If both parties are interested in the, if both parties are interested, the investigator will facilitate the discussion and reduce the agreement in writing, and if both parties agree, they sign off the agreement, and the case is closed or settled. If the respondent is not willing to resolve the complaint, the investigation will continue. Once the response to the complaint is received, the investigator will take the time to review the response and then make arrangements to share this with the claimant to obtain what we call the rebuttal to the respondent's answer. And I did want to point out that we are fact finders, and I'll go over some of the bases that we actually cover: race, disability, retaliation, sex, age, national origin, religion, marital status, color, and familial status. And I'm not sure about the audience, but by a raise of hands, can you tell me how many individuals here are realtors? Okay, all right. One thing that I'd like to point out is that it is important that respondents communicate with residents and customers effectively, and when they don't, that can result in a complaint. I've been an investigator before I became a deputy director. Some discrimination is blatant, it is, but some of it is just due to a lack of knowledge and lack of education. So if you're a landlord or if you're a respondent, we just encourage you to reach out to one of the fair housing centers in your area to get information. They have fact sheets. They do training, so we do training at the Michigan Department of Civil Rights. And sometimes, again, it's just a matter of a misunderstanding that can be easily cleared up. And if you are a realtor, you can ensure that you are receiving fair housing training at least annually to keep abreast of the fair housing laws. And there's a plethora of info on the websites for the Fair Housing Centers, MDCR, and HUD. And just do your own research. And even though we do investigate fair housing complaints, we will answer questions, even though we are not advocates. Again, we are committed to eliminating discrimination, and we're committed to fair housing. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Sonia. We're going to enter into a facilitated conversation, but we do want to make sure that there is enough time for Q&A, so I'll just ask our lovely organizers to let us know when we have about 15 minutes left for our session. But I want to start with a question for you, Rashanek. You talked a lot about public health, which you're singing my language, and I appreciate that. But I wanted to ask you, when you are thinking about public health and housing discrimination, can you make some connections for folks around those two topics?
Yeah. Can you all hear me? Okay. Nope. Oh, wow. Okay. Hi, Rashanek speaking. So when we talk about housing discrimination in the public health realm, which we talk very little about, the primary things that we talk about are the impacts on the individual level and then at the community level. And at the individual level, we talk about the immediate impacts, which are often highly correlated with the stress, anxiety, depression that folks experience as they're going through housing discrimination, to more of the long-term impact. So if folks are getting displaced, what does that look like? What does that bring? And it goes on to, like, where do they end up? What are the neighborhoods that they are exposed to then? And so that is at the individual level. And then at the community level, we know that if we are displacing folks, we are creating a level of, unorganized or just change, constant change in a neighborhood, which brings its own levels of issues along with that have been associated with a breakdown in social cohesion, so that breakdown in communities and such. And so public health could really play a big role in examining housing discrimination and its impacts on it, and essentially also elevate the issue. I always use the example of the CDC and how they brought in the COVID-19 eviction moratorium, and that was unprecedented. And so, but it does lead the way for organizations that are more focused on public health to then be able to release funding and address these issues that don't naturally, or it's not an easy connection to make when it comes to public health, but could still be done.
Thank you for that. Do any of our other panelists want to speak on this topic of public health? I'm looking at you, Haywood, or Stephen, or Sonia.
Well, I think from my perspective, this is Stephen, by the way. From my perspective, I've observed the same sorts of things. As I said, I primarily, until I came to work for the Fair Housing Center, did criminal defense work. And most of what I did was court-appointed. And when you have these kinds of disparities, and you said the exact word that I was thinking, hope. When people don't have hope, they give up. And that's going to impact not only their health, but it's going to impact their ability to go out and actually want to look for a better place to live, or to have the motivation, because they think no matter what I do, it's not going to matter. And that was the thing I ran across the most, and I still run across that now when I find people who are in very low quality housing and they complain about it, and I say, well, why do you still want to live there? And they say, because I'm never going to be able to find anything else. And usually when I ask them, I say, well, when did you look? I haven't even bothered, because I just know it's not going to happen. And so when you have people in those kinds of isolated situations, it does a lot more than just determine some of those outcomes on a physical level, but it takes a psychological toll that then interprets itself into more of a long-term problem, I think.
Yeah, thank you for that. And Haywood, you mentioned hope a lot in your comments, and I just wonder if you have any way for us to regain that hope in the work that you're doing at MHDS.
Thank you. Again, Haywood Edwards. I do speak about hope. I understand the importance of believing, first of all, that your trajectory can be adjusted, that the direction that you're moving in can be adapted. I believe that we, as professionals working for government agencies who've been entrusted with the well-being of the public, we have to operate in a way that, first of all, where we're cognizant of the past. Often we hear that, well, we're in a post-racial society. You had a black president. What else do you want? Everything should be okay now. But the reality of it is that we have to understand the missteps of the past in order to move forward. I'll say that again for everyone in the back. Like, we have to recognize the missteps of the past in order to move forward. There's even epigenetic research that talks about trauma that's in the DNA people and how that affects how you view the world and whether or not you think that an opportunity even applies to you. Much of the discrimination that occurs, and Steve, you mentioned this, you really can't find the numbers for it because a person may walk into a bank and feel discouraged and turn around and walk back out. How do you document that? How do you document the fact that someone may tell their children, look in this neighborhood because they don't want you there? And so we have to understand the past in order to move forward. I enjoy thoroughly working with professionals like Nancy Haynes from the Fair Housing Center of West Michigan. She knows her stuff, and she's not shy when she declares that we have to be able to correct the missteps of the past, the mistakes of the past, and how we move forward. It's very important that we have hope and understand that it can happen.
Thank you for that. Absolutely. And when we think about this aspect of hope and of taking action, I want to bring in Sonia and speak a little bit about some of the complaints that are brought to you in an effort to help folks understand what's happening in the landscape, but also what we can do about it. So I guess a two-part question. We'll start with you on that one and then throw it to the rest of our panelists to chime in.
Well, again, my name is Sonia Merriweather, and I did want to comment on something that Haywood pointed out, and that's generational trauma. Because as a parent or a grandparent, we pass that trauma through our bloodline. And so if I'm discriminated against as a parent, I may say, well, you know, I don't know if you want to apply for a home loan to my child, or you want to look in this area. So that is major, and that's something that we need to think about, you know, within our community, because we do pass that down. So part of the question is some of the examples of cases filed with the Michigan Department of Civil Rights. I have some examples here. Claimant is white, single mother of 2 children who received an eviction notice from her white landlords for living in, quote, willful sin, according to their religious beliefs, when they learned that she had invited her black boyfriend over to her apartment. We investigated this case and settled it for a cash settlement of $10,000. Another part of this is based on disability. Claimant alleged the respondent failed to accommodate a disability. This case was settled for a cash payment of $6,000 and the implementation of a reasonable accommodation policy. So it's not just about the money. We like to see and want to see policy changed. I'll give you one more, and it's claimant is an unmarried person who alleged she was subjected to other terms and conditions when trying to rent an apartment from the respondent. This case was settled for a change in their rental application disclosure policy regarding adult co-tenants and the minimum income requirement. So those are some of the cases that we see, but what I'd like to just say is, again, what I stated earlier, is that training is important. Sometimes we hear from respondents, well, I didn't know. Well, that's not a good answer. You should know. And there's a wealth of information out to the respondents. And just have the conversation with individuals, have your policies readily available. And when I was an investigator, we would actually go out to these agencies or apartment complexes, and we will ask to see the policy. We want to see the policy, and we want to know how these policies are distributed to the tenants.
Just to add to that, Sonia, when you were talking, then I heard you say evictions, and I think that's another big issue that, like, often folks don't connect all these dots, but when we were talking about FICO scores, right, credit scores, sorry, eviction filings, even if they're not taken to action, so even if the person is not evicted, that counts against them in many different ways. And so that also creates this whole systemic process of discrimination throughout, like, the long-term effects. And there hasn't been as much research, but that is definitely an area that needs to be investigated more closely.
So as we think about these complaints and investigations, Steve, I wanted to bring you into the conversation and get just a little deeper understanding of the work that you do, and what are the biggest challenges that you come across when uncovering discrimination in these cases?
That's a good question. And this is Stephen. I think we do a pretty good job of uncovering a lot of it through our testing program, and we also have clients who just come to us who say, hey, I've got this issue. But a lot of times, as I said in my introductory statement, people who are being discriminated against just don't know it. Because the property manager may seem very friendly and smiling and happy, and they're glad to give you all kinds of information, but you have no way of knowing if that information is accurate. So that's really the biggest hurdle in uncovering it. Our bigger problem is enforcement, because we've got basically three routes. We can go through MDCR, we can go through HUD, or we can go through the courts. Most of the time when my clients come to me, and if it's a testing thing, it's almost always an MDCR or a HUD complaint. But when my clients come to me and they are actively being discriminated against, they need a solution right away. And if I send something to HUD, if I send a complaint to HUD or I send a complaint to MDCR, it's going to take weeks or months for me to actually get any kind of a result. Sometimes it takes that long just to get an investigation going. But if I can go to the courts, as I think it was Lisa said in the opening session, I can get a TRO. And I can shut it down right there until the case is over. The problem is once we get to that point, if you have someone on the other side who is, say, a large property management company, and we're his sons, they will spend a lot of money on experts, and they're going to require depositions, and they're going to do all this kind of stuff that we can't do. Because my clients tend to be, even though we don't have an income cap on discrimination claims, my clients still tend to be people who are indigent. They can't afford $75 an hour for a court reporter for a deposition. They can't afford $750 for a mediator. They can't afford to hire a private investigator or to hire someone to go through records. And so our biggest problem that we run into at that point is money. And there's no, as far as I know, there's no fund that we can dip into to help indigent people who are in civil cases fighting against discrimination to be able to pursue those claims at trial. So that's kind of the biggest problem that we face.
Thank you for that. So funding, it's a crutch for all of us. With our last few minutes before we get into Q&A, Haywood, I noticed that there is a new analysis that's coming out soon, and I was wondering if you wanted to talk a little bit about that, what the analysis is, and what we could expect from it.
Okay, thank you. Haywood Edwards. So I have a statement, a prepared statement that I'm looking at here, which speaks of how we as an agency, we want everyone to be treated fairly. Whether you're buying, renting, leasing, selling, advertising, or financing a house or other dwelling, we want to make sure that you're treated fairly. There are federal fair housing laws, as you all know, and then here in Michigan, Elliott-Larsen Act, which provides additional protections. And so what we do, and when I say we, those who receive funds from HUD are required to do what is called an analysis of impediments. And so when you receive those dollars from HUD, you have to conduct this comprehensive examination of the fair housing issues and the related planning goals for your community. And so there are a lot of communities in Michigan that are not state government that receive those funds, that are larger usually. And so they have to do this analysis of impediments, which we call an AI. MISHDA completed an AI in 2016. We are now in the process, this is every 5 years you're supposed to do it, but there was a time period with the changing of administrations of whether or not it was even a requirement. We are now in the process of issuing an RFP to find a vendor, to find a partner to help us to prepare our next AI. Our goal is to make sure that this AI is thorough. We want to examine all over Michigan and understand what the challenges, the hindrances, the impediments are when it comes to fair housing in every community. There will be opportunities for feedback. There will be surveys coming at you from everywhere. So we want to make sure that that feedback and your input is included in this analysis. And hopefully with this analysis, we will then be able to adapt our policies and our programs to better make sure that we are pursuing equity in all of our practices. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yes, thank you so much.
Other stuff.
So I want to give our panelists an opportunity for final comments before we jump into Q&A. So we'll start here with you, Roshana.
Housing is a determinant of health, and housing discrimination at the intersection of all the different characteristics we've talked about, including race and ethnicity, is definitely something that needs to be more funded. I know there isn't any funding bodies here that would fund this, but more partnerships too with our organizations that are working. We're always open to working with community organizations to better understand the data, and we work with you. We don't own the data, we don't own the products, we just geek out with that data and want to work with you on it.
We're doing that statement.
Yes, we're doing last
Okay.
statements.
All right. Thank you. I feel like I've talked a lot, so I'll keep this brief. How many MISHDA employees do we have in the audience? Can you all stand? We've got a few here, a few in the back. All right, good. My crew is in the house. There's so much that needs to be done. As we look forward to the future, we're discussing the state of fair housing. We talked about the past and maybe some of the things that we're doing right now. We have to have a clear picture of what we want the state of fair housing to be. And for that to happen, we need to have everyone at the table. We need to have feedback. And I'll double back around to something that you said, Ms. Irby, in the beginning. We have to think about who's forgotten. Who are the people that we never asked their opinion? That if we are the authority, the housing authority for Michigan, and we provide vouchers, you would think that we would survey the people who actually have vouchers, right? So that's where we need to start. Who are the people that we haven't brought to the table who are still marginalized? And I think that's the key to developing a future for our children and our grandchildren.
Thank you for that. Stephen.
This is Stephen. I'm like Haywood. I think I spoke a lot, probably a little too much. The thing that strikes me most when I look at this is just the amount of the impact that education has actually had on this issue. Like I said in the beginning, attitudes have been changing over time, and I think that that's largely because people became more educated about the effects of policies that they were really having on individuals. And I think there's been a recognition that discrimination is baked into our society. And we're not in Florida, I can say that, right? But I think that somebody got that, good. Man, I am going to be banned from going to the state now. But I think that the kind of education that's led to some of these changes so far is what we need, even when we're talking about other kinds of discrimination, like disability discrimination. Because again, I think like Sonia said, a lot of their excuses, well, I didn't know. Well, ignorance is not an excuse when it comes to the law. So I think education is going to be a big part of it, and I think that overcoming that kind of cynicism that I talked about earlier with a lot of landlords and property managers is also a key part of what we need to be focusing on.
Thank you. And Sonia.
My name is Sonia Merriweather, and I just want to end by saying that where we live affects all aspects of our lives, access to the type of schools, access to health care, the type of foods we eat, safety. So someone asked in the earlier plenary is how you can get involved. I would say you don't have to work for a state agency or a federal agency. Contact the fair housing centers and get involved, and don't be afraid to speak up if you see or know about any type of discrimination. Don't be afraid to speak up and go to some of the agencies that help fight discrimination. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And now I want to call our incredible facilitators to help us. We've got 2 mics, so we have Sabrina and Sunshine in the audience. If there are any questions for our panelists, I see we've got a hand right here in the front.
My name is Sierra Eddington. I'm a civil rights investigator for the city of Detroit. And the question I have is, we hear often homeownership creates generational wealth. And I want to ask, how so? How does homeownership create generational wealth?
Thank you.
Well, I mean,
Go ahead.
You can certainly answer, Steve. Just the simple answer is that the home, that family home, is usually that primary way of building wealth, but first of all, with equity, with the appreciation of that home value down through the years. And so if the example that I gave earlier of 2 people coming back from the war, one was able to purchase a home with a low or no interest loan on the house. 30 years later, their family has accumulated wealth just because of the home, let alone what Sonia said, because now they have a home, they have a neighborhood, they have access to probably better health care, better schools, that person, their life, their children will look different than that other person who then was condemned to live in a government-ordained, quote-unquote, slum. And so that ability to be able to have generational wealth usually starts with that home.
And it goes beyond that. Because, as you said, you build equity. Well, what is that equity often used for? It's often used to pay for education. It's often used to pay for medical expenses. And so if you don't have access to that equity that your house is built up, you don't have access to those opportunities. And it's, in addition to whether or not your parents owned a home as to being the leading indicator as to whether you will own your own home, whether your parents went to college is a leading indicator of whether you're going to go to college. And so this is I referred to this earlier with the redlining and the disparities that we see that fall along largely racial and gender lines. It's because people were denied these opportunities in the past, and now we're reaping the rewards, I guess you will, of those bad decisions that were made so many years ago.
I'll add to that too. In addition to the attaining the home in the first place and all the barriers folks have faced, in cities like Detroit, now we're talking about also the denial of maintaining that home, right? So the discriminatory processes that occurred during the tax foreclosure crisis. And so those generational homes being ripped away from folks and then taking away. So it's like this constant cascade of barriers that Black and brown folks face in this country.
Yeah, and thank you for that. And just to reiterate, zip codes really determine our trajectory. So when we think about, when we are talking about generational wealth, but also there's generational trauma, that there's so many things for us to consider how it's impacting us today, which is why history is so critically important to these conversations. Any other questions? I think we have time for one or two more.
My name is Donald Stuckey with the Michigan League for Public Policy, and I wanted to ask a question based on some legislation that's currently going through Lansing, and I'll just focus on two of them, given that I will make sure everybody else has an opportunity to ask a question. The first one is the source of income legislation, SB Senate Bill 205, 206, and 207, that deals with a renter's source of income, how a person decides to pay for their rental housing. So that legislation is pending in the legislature and is currently moving. And then the other one is Senate Bill 801, which has recently come up for some testimony. That one deals with eviction record sealing and expungement, protections against being able to seal the records after a certain amount of time. I just wanted to get your thoughts on that. I don't know if you can comment on those, but I just wanted to see what you think about those things in trying to combat those two specific kinds of discrimination. Thank you.
The first one that you mentioned, the source of income, it's part of what we look at, again, with our partnership with the Fair Housing Centers of Michigan. And I've learned so much over the last few years, again, with Nancy and her crew there in West Michigan, and Steve, Fair Housing Center, Metro Detroit, and the others. Source of income, when you think about it, if someone has SSI and they're paying their bills, why are they discriminated against when it comes to purchasing a home when they have an income? So there are some communities that have additional protections. I believe it's Ann Arbor, right? Ann Arbor has source of income as a protection. And so it is certainly my hope that protections like this that are in some areas, that they can be expanded at least statewide and hopefully federal as far as protections. Because there are many people who do not have the usual income. And again, there's a lot of bias when you start talking about the credit score and everything else. but source of income is very important. There are other ones I think that you mentioned with the past, the history of eviction, and so on. There's so much bias there. And so our hope is to be able to eliminate, first of all, identify where we see bias, and then find ways to eliminate it. And I think, I haven't read that bill, but I'd like to read it and see what it entails.
On our website, Housing Solutions for Health Equity, we have a report on eviction filings, and currently we have a study with the community legal partners in Philadelphia who have done some of this work. It is encouraging. As I mentioned, eviction filings can have this cascade of effects on folks being able to access housing. And so there's a lot of ups and downs to both of those arguments.
And I think those are both very important bills for related but different reasons. What I see a lot is that source of income discrimination is often a proxy for race discrimination. They will assume rightly or wrongly that somebody's getting Section 8 as black. And they will use that as a proxy for racial discrimination. And so that's become, and that's one of the things that we run across a lot is, you know, they just won't take me because I'm Section 8. Well, they're entitled to do that right now. The eviction expungement is also a very, very important piece. Part of what I do is just run-of-the-mill landlord-tenant cases at Legal Services. And so the primary thing we try to do is try to avoid people getting a judgment on their record in the first place. Because you have a judgment on your record, it's almost impossible to find another place to live. And so that contributes to homelessness. So being able to have those kinds of evictions and judgments expunged is a huge, huge step forward in reducing or, you know, hopefully, cross your fingers, ending homelessness in Michigan. And I think those are both hugely important bills, and I'm glad that you mentioned them.
Thank you. I see we have one final question, and we've got to be quick because we don't want to stand in between everyone and lunch.
I'll try to be very quick and talk fast. I just want to highlight what Haywood said, and all of you have said about it's a time of hope. I've never seen the state of Michigan. I've been doing this since 1999. I've been in the trenches doing fair housing, and I've never seen a MSHDA as engaged on fair housing. MDCR is finally getting the resources they need to be able to work through the backlog of cases and do fair housing like they need. The legislation that you highlighted, those bills, as well as Fair Chance, which gets at criminal history. I've never seen our legislature be so focused on housing. So it's a time of excitement. How do we institutionalize this momentum so that it doesn't change with the next election?
That's a good question. Any takers?
I think my funding sources make it so I can't answer that question. But I do need to talk to you when we're done.
But that's definitely our hope. And from the beginning, when I first met Nancy, working with MSHDA and, you know, Fair Housing Centers and that partnership, where we provide a grant to support education, outreach, and testing. I want this to continue. I want us to expand. I want us to be able to do more. Because, as Steve, as you mentioned, sometimes it's because of lack of knowledge, right? There's some people who just don't understand that if you're showing an apartment to I'm not going to say a senior citizen because I think it might include me now, but if you're showing an apartment to an older person and you purposely don't show them the exercise room, you made a decision, well, they probably don't need to exercise. You've discriminated against that person. I think it's called steering. And so there are things that people just, it's because of lack of education. But there are so many other pieces of the puzzle. We have to make sure that it's ingrained and it becomes part of the tapestry of who we are. And the way to do that, you use the right word, institutionalize. And to make sure, we have to normalize it, first of all. To make it's not something that we do just if we have disposable income in our budget. No, this should be a first item in our budget to make sure that fair housing education takes place.
Thank you so much for all of these comments. And while we could discuss this all day, and I know that we have some other questions, the panelists will be here throughout the day, so you can come and speak to them. We have been collecting your comments. Again, as we mentioned, we want to end all of our sessions with 2 to 3 policy recommendations. So folks have been taking notes, and we're going to produce those results after the fact. So please be on the lookout for that. It is now lunchtime, and we begin, well, actually, I think I will throw it over to you to tell us about lunch and how that's going to work.
Very quickly, thank you. This panel has put a lot of time, energy, and effort leading up to this moment and have given us a really good opportunity to think and ponder the very important things before us. Thank you very much for your time. Yes, absolutely.